Tudo bem?
Agora, Marta.
Okay. Boa tarde a todos e todas que nos ouvem. Antes de apresentar a nossa ilustre conferencista desta tarde, Shana, colega de muitas jornadas acadêmicas, relembro que o Abralin ao Vivo é um evento totalmente gratuito, planejado pelo atual diretoria da Abralin, Associação Brasileira de Linguística, e conta com a cooperação do Comité Internacional Permanente de Linguistas, da Associação de Linguística e Filología da América Latina, da Sociedade Argentina de Estudios Linguísticos e da Sociedade Linguística da América. Fazendo coro com outros colegas, é importante enfatizar que a pandemia causada pelo novo coronavírus nos impôs um distanciamento social necessário, que precisa ser respeitado por todas e todos. No entanto, a distância física não indica a ruptura da comunicação. Pensando nisso, a atual diretoria da Abralin idealizou esse evento para que estudantes, professores, pesquisadores e demais interessados pudessem ter livre acesso a apresentações e discussões sobre diversos temas relacionados ao estudo da linguagem humana, nosso bem maior inalienável. Congregar pessoas e difundir conhecimentos sempre foi a função da Abralin, a nossa associação. Por isso é importante que delas sejamos associados sem distanciamento. Pois é. A segunda conferencista de hoje... Eu fui desligar meu telefone. A segunda conferencista de hoje, 7 de maio de 2020, é Shana Poplack, professora catedrática, desculpem, ilustre, eu sempre me embaralhei, da Faculdade de Artes da Universidade de Ottawa, Canadá. Shana é uma cidadã de destaque, de renome, liderança expressiva, com amplo reconhecimento institucional canadense. Desde 2001, Shana tem o título de Canada Research Chair, cadeira de pesquisa do Canadá, concedido pelo governo canadense, acompanhado de recursos institucionais substanciais para custear a pesquisa da titular na área das humanidades. Desde 2014, Shana é membro da Ordem do Canadá, a segunda honraria e mérito mais alta concedida pelo sistema de honraria do Canadá a pessoas que se destacam pela dedicação à comunidade e pelos serviços prestados à nação. Desde 1982, Shana é diretora do Laboratório de Sociolinguística no Departamento de Linguística, no Canadá, onde desenvolve ampla pesquisa linguística com um elenco invejável de pesquisadores. Nessa conferência de hoje, o foco de sua palestra se volta para suas reflexões sobre code switching, mudança de código por falantes bilíngues ou multilíngues. Trabalhos perspicazes e sólidos, com voos teóricos instigantes neste braço dos estudos de línguas em ato. Portanto, teremos o prazer de aprender um pouco mais sobre uma teoria do code switching, a proposta de Shana Poplack. Shana, a palavra agora é você.
Muito obrigada, Marta. Muito obrigada, Miguel. Obrigada, Abralin. É realmente uma grande honra, um grande prazer estar aqui com vocês hoje. É claro que teria preferido de estar aí, no Brasil, como nas outras vezes em que dei palestra na Abralin. Assim como disse o David Crystal no outro dia, Eu também tenho saudades da caipirinha e da feijoada, mas mais do que tudo, tenho saudades dos meus caros amigos e colegas brasileiros. Eu estou pensando em vocês. O vídeo. Estou pensando em vocês e desejando muita saúde para todos nestes tempos difíceis. Adorava poder dizer isto pessoalmente, mas hoje vamos ter que nos conformar com o Zoom. Esperemos que vai funcionar. So, code switching. No outcome of language contact has attracted more attention than code switching. Literally thousands of publications have been devoted to it over the last 50 years. But, and for me, this is a truly remarkable comment on the sociology of the field, there is still no consensus on what a code switch is, let alone what rules constrain it, whether they're universal, language specific, community specific, whether all mixed constituents arise from the same process, or whether code switching alters the structures of the languages involved. And it seems like the more people publish, the less consensus we see. At my lab, we've been studying language contact on the ground for many years. We're heavily committed to understanding bilingual speakers' actual performance, by which I mean how they combine languages spontaneously in the course of their everyday interactions. We've recorded their speech data and built them into large-scale bilingual corpora, and these then serve as the basis for systematic quantitative analysis. Those analyses have yielded some very clear patterns, and they go a long way towards helping us understand just why there's so much controversy. I think there are at least 4 reasons. One is that researchers may be listening more to their theory than to their data. And even if they do consult data, they may be targeting those elements in the data that support those theories and maybe giving short shrift to others that don't. This kind of cherry picking prevents us from distinguishing idiosyncratic occurrences from widespread patterns and minor trends from robust strategies. Nor can we contextualize the examples we're investigating with respect to the speaker's unmixed language or with respect to that of other members of her speech community. And the result is that they're mixing apples and oranges. What's wrong with that, you might ask? Well, that's what I'd like to explore with you today. Before we do, though, I just want to stress, as you may have suspected, that I have my own theories and my own opinions about all this stuff, but what I'm going to talk about today isn't based on them. It's based on large-scale, systematic, quantitative analyses of the way bilinguals actually use their languages. So far, we've looked at nearly 500 people and over 43,000 instances of language mixing in more than a dozen typologically different and similar language pairs. The starting point for all these analyses is the speech community, a group of individuals who share a set of norms regarding the use of language. In a bilingual community, these norms extend to the use of 2 or more languages, and they include such things as the propensity to code switch between them in the first place, strategies for integrating borrowings, and the stock of widespread loanwords, among many others. Linguistic behavior, whether monolingual or bilingual, is heavily constrained by this kind of community norm. And these are not predictable solely from the typological characteristics or actually any other purely linguistic properties of the languages in contact. But unless we know what they are, we are doomed to remain in the dark about whether a given bilingual utterance is idiosyncratic or a patterned occurrence, whether items are being integrated into a recipient language or switched into a donor language, or what the function of language mixing is, if any. It's the community that licenses different mixing types and establishes conventions for drawing on them. And importantly, these may well differ from one community to the next, even when the same language pair is involved. This is why with mixes involving verbs in Spanish, you might hear people construct them with the Spanish light verb hacer and an English bare infinitive, or you may simply find, as in Puerto Rican Spanish, that the English stem is conjugated according to Spanish morphology. As far as I'm concerned, nowhere is Leboeuf's observation that the behavior of an individual can only be understood through the behavior of their social group more relevant. So in our work, we put a huge premium on contextualizing language contact phenomena, in the bilingual community that produced them. Some of the communities we've studied are huge, like the National Capital Region of Canada, which some of you may be familiar with because we've been working on it for decades now. Way back in the 80s, we built a massive bilingual corpus based on a sociologically representative sample of francophones. And then about 25 years later, we went back to one of the areas we had studied earlier and recorded more people, adding a real-time perspective. And in an incredible stroke of luck, we also discovered some old recordings of Québécois made in the 1940s and 50s, but born as far back as 1846. So we built a corpus out of those too. And these data taken together and comprising hundreds of speakers and millions of words of bilingual speech give us an apparent time span of nearly a century and a half, or 61 years in real time. Either way, an unprecedented amount of time, which allows us to go beyond studying language mixing synchronically, which is what most people do, to diachrony. And in this way, we can answer questions about the trajectory of bilingual behavior over time. And by that, I mean things like whether loanwords actually originate as code switches, or whether a change is contact induced or internal, and so on. Questions that, as far as we know, had been impossible to address empirically before. Other communities we study have been way smaller, but they're no less useful because those enable us to reproduce and replicate our studies on a variety of typologically different language pairs. We also put a huge premium on data. These days, corpus building, especially bi and multilingual corpus building, is all the rage. So there's plenty of data around, thank goodness, but not all of it is created equal. Spontaneous vernacular speech is what is most likely to give rise to the kind of bilingual phenomena we're interested in. And this has been amply demonstrated by now. Here's an example of the type of speech I'm talking about.
Je suis rocking the chair encore. So anyways, j'étais après me rocker. Ma mère, je me rappelle, elle m'a dit, tombe pas endormi sur ça. Next thing I knew, I woke up and I was blind for about a week.
Wow.
It hit my, something in my brains. Like I had, ma mère a dit, j'avais tombé droit sur le ciment. Et puis je m'assommais la tête d'être là. Et puis, I was unconscious for about 2 hours. Et puis ils m'ont emmené à l'hôpital, puis je pouvais pas voir rien.
So say you have a corpus like this and you want to study code switching. Now what? Well, the first step is to acknowledge that code switching is not the only type of language mixing that's going on here. In fact, as we found out the hard way, it's actually the rarest kind. And in some data sets, it's even non-existent. But most bilingual corpora constructed in a principal way are at least going to contain a few types of other language materials, as in this excerpt.
J'ai dit, God, please help me. Ils sont tous sous, puis ils veulent driver, puis moi j'ai peur quand quelqu'un drive. So j'ai dit, OK, that's it. Pow! Je l'ai assommé, j'ai pris la roue. Honest to God, j'ai pris la roue, j'ai dit, bon Dieu, s'il vous plaît, emmène-moi direct à la maison. Honest to God, il m'a emmené direct à la maison. J'ai drôné de 5000 de la classe jusqu'à sa maison à le monsieur. Puis je ne savais pas même si c'était à sa maison, puis je l'ai emmené de chez eux. Il dit, le next morning, j'ai couché là avec tout le monde, parce que j'avais pas d'autre place. Ils disent, how did we get here? I said, the Lord brought you. Honest to God, the Lord brought you.
Are all of these English incorporations code switches? Lots of people like to think they are. So what would be so terrible if we analyze them together? After all, they're all English. So by Occam's razor, we should. Well, what's terrible is that they don't necessarily behave the same way. And you can see that right here from the way the speaker handles her English verbs. She conjugates some of them in French, like driver in the second line, and others in English, like brought and did we get. So are these just random choices, or are they patterned? And if so, what's the pattern? As a spoiler alert, I'm a variationist, so I know they're not random. For us, the challenge is to discover what constrains those speaker choices. And doing that involves circumscribing a variable context, or in this case, distinguishing bilingual phenomena. And this is probably the most controversial area in language contact research. Because even if we're lucky enough to have a corpus with different kinds of language mixing, we still have to determine whether they're code switches, loanwords, or something else. Of course, there are going to be many clear cases of each, but there will be many more where it's difficult and sometimes impossible to tell which of these processes has taken place. Surface appearance may not help because different grammars can give rise to superficially similar outcomes, and nowhere is this more evident than with single other language incorporations. What is their status? In much of the literature, the answer is dictated by theory. We think it's an empirical question, and we address it by first determining the features of the unambiguous cases, and then by triangulation, comparing them to each other and to the ambiguous cases. So let's have a look at how we go about this. The first big cut we can make is with regards to borrowed material and switched. Now, I know this may sound contradictory because I just said we can't even agree on what code switching is, but we do know what loanwords are, and we know how they behave because just about all languages already have a whole load of them. Here are just a few of the thousands of French loanwords in English. Loanwords happened already. Thanks to the historical record, we know that they tend to be single words from another language, and we know that they are felt to be indistinguishable from native words in the recipient language. Some of them have even made it into dictionaries of that language. So linguistically, this means that they are integrated into the recipient language. We inflect them with English morphology, we position them according to English syntax, and we may even give them English phonology. Another way of saying this is that they shed their donor language grammar and adopt the grammar of the recipient language. Now, until fairly recently, most linguists didn't really care about loanwords beyond the fun of listing them, but they really shouldn't be underestimated because we know how they got into the language and we know how they turned out. So we can use them as a benchmark against which to measure the status of the less clear-cut cases. So how do we go about this? Well, for one thing, we can refer them to make an initial distinction between candidates for loanword status and other things. And a quick and dirty way to do this is simply to separate single words from multi-word fragments. Of course, it's never so simple. We always have to make principled decisions about how to categorize things. For example, all of these are ostensibly multi-word fragments, but the first, couch potatoes, is an attested English compound functioning as a single word, so we'd probably want to class it with the single words, while the third one would go with the multi-word fragments. The second case, les marxistes, looks like a constituent insertion, which are common in Arabic, although we can't be sure from its surface appearance. So just to be safe, we can provisionally put them in a category of their own. And then there are fixed expressions. These are also incorporated unanalyzed, but They differ in many ways from compounds, so these should probably also go in a separate category. Let me just make clear that these initial categorizations are only heuristic. We're trying to find out whether the linguistic or the extralinguistic behavior of these elements warrants treating them as the same thing or not. And for that, you're going to need some diagnostic feature, which I'll come to in a minute. But a data scan like this, however rough, already brings to light a first result that recurs consistently in each of our studies. Multi-word sequences of the other language, like this one.
À moins qu'il dirait que the brain is completely finished, puis que tout est fini.
What I would call unambiguous switches are extremely scarce relative to single other language items like these.
Il y avait une bande qui jouait de la musique steady, puis il y avait des games de ball, puis ils vendaient de l'ice cream, puis il y avait une grosse beach, le monde se baignait.
And even these single items, although they're astronomically more frequent than the multi-word stretches, are vanishingly rare in comparison to unmixed material. So already you can see that the incidence of language mixing is greatly exaggerated. And of course, this has attendant repercussions on the quantity and the quality of the data you're going to be needing if you want to study it. So that's one problem. Another problem is that even the single items that make up the vast majority of the data don't form a homogeneous class. Some may be full-fledged loanwords, but others may be code switches, since of course there is no constraint against switching single words. How can we tell? Well, we can ask our theory, or we can ask the data. In our lab, for example, we begin by checking whether they happen to be listed in recipient language dictionaries. If they are, the likelihood is that they were acquired along with the remainder of the recipient language, as opposed to specifically via mixing. These are what are known as bona fide loanwords. Now, because some of our corpora are made up of many speakers, we can also appeal to the much more reliable measures of recurrence in the individual and diffusion across the community. Highly frequent and widely diffused words, like these ones, are also likely to be loanwords, even if they're not attested in the dictionary. And by the way, we make this determination by counting, not by feeling. And finally, because our corpora are both large and digitized, we can also measure the corpus frequency of each word. And this is how we found out that some of these single other language items are nonce words, right? Unattested donor language words said only once by only one speaker. So using these tools, we can now subdivide the class of single other language items, distinguishing between ones that are dictionary attested, frequent, and or widespread in the community on the one hand, and nonce forms, the most ambiguous and controversial ones, on the other. And this exercise brings to light another recurrent result. The vast majority of single other language items are established loanwords like gang, which came into French in 1837.
On était toute une gang ensemble, on voyait tout comme des fous.
While nonce words, like this one, are relatively rare.
On avait les planchers à la main, tu sais. Après ça, on polishait avec notre fessier.
And this isn't just a cool distributional fact, it has important analytical consequences, because I know of no one who would want to consider bona fide loanwords like these to be code switches, or even to result from any kind of mixing at all. On the contrary, speakers typically don't even know they came from another language. I certainly didn't until I took a historical linguistics class. So take these results as a cautionary tale. Bilingual data consists largely of single other language items, and the vast majority of them are either full-fledged loanwords or widespread borrowings that likely never arose from mixing, synchronic mixing, in the first place. And all of them are vanishingly rare. And for the incredulous, I would just point out that the relative frequency of mixing types that I just described emerges not only in 3 independently constituted French-English corpora, but it also recurs in other data sets and other language pairs that have been quantitatively studied. Here are some of the ones that our team has looked at. And in each case, despite the conviction going in that people code switch all the time, once the material is sorted out, we always get the same result. Multi-word switches are extremely rare, and in a non-negligible number of cases, they're non-existent. What this means is that most language mixing consists of lone other language insertions. And this discovery has huge repercussions on any attempt at generalizability, because it shows that however the analyst decides to treat those single words will inevitably skew the results. Now, I noted earlier that the single items aren't a homogeneous class. Most are established loanwords, that's true, but a good number are nonce words. If you already know something about code switching, you've heard of nonce borrowings because they have become enormously controversial. What's their status? Are they code switches? Are they loanwords? Or something else altogether? And how can we tell? Once again, we have the choice between looking to theory or looking to the data. And we think that since most other language material can either be code switched or borrowed, the answer has to come from the speakers themselves, that is, from the way they handle the material. And this can be examined from a number of perspectives. One comes from simply comparing their lexical constitution. This graph charts the distribution of grammatical categories across mixing strategies. Single word incorporations, whether widespread, that's the green bar, or nonce, the red bar, are almost entirely constituted of content words, that's on the left. While words within longer stretches, the blue bars, show no restriction as to part of speech. You can see that a full half of them are function words on the right. Very few are nouns, although these account for up to 2/3 of the loan items. 2/3 of them are nouns. If all of these are instantiations of the same strategy, why the discrepancy? Well, it's because the distributions of these grammatical categories derive from different sources. The nonce forms work just like established borrowings in the recipient language, while words in the longer stretches, those blue bars, align perfectly with the donor language, as you can see here in the black. So this is a first indication that nonce words are not treated like code switches. But a much stronger test of their status involves identifying the grammar that's operating on them. If it's the grammar of the donor language, they must have been switched into that language. But if it's that of the recipient, they would have been borrowed, even if only for the nonce. So to address this, we compared the way the same speakers treat English origin content words occurring in 3 guises: as nonce forms, like ball bearings in this example.
Fait que ça, c'est une compagnie allemande et suisse qui fait les ball bearings, SKW.
Or as more frequent borrowings, like gaz.
Parce qu'il y avait du gaz en anglais.
And finally, as words within unambiguous multi-word code switches.
And it was likely higher in 1981, when price hit an all-time high.
Notice that this is the same guy, right? Number 82, doing all these different kinds of mixing. Now, what do we compare? Well, we look for conflict sites, areas of the grammar where different languages call for different treatment. If nonce words are code switches, then their linguistic behavior should parallel that of the donor language. And this in turn should contrast with that of established loanwords, which we already know to be governed by recipient language grammar. Maybe the most straightforward conflict site for the French-English pair is verb inflection. When an English origin verb is incorporated into French, the speaker has to choose between English morphology, illustrated here.
A few planes crashed into the World Trade Center.
And French morphology, which the same speaker is using on the same verb a few seconds later.
Le building est en feu, il y a un avion qui a crashé dedans.
We found that nonce verb forms are always integrated into French. The strategy, which is conjugate them according to the French first conjugation paradigm, the ER paradigm, is exactly the same one that's applied to native neologisms involving verbs too. English verbs in multi-word stretches, on the other hand, always display English morphology. Other good diagnostics for the French-English pair include determiner realization, sorry, because the contexts requiring null and overt determiners differ, as in this example here, and adjective placement, whether preposed or postposed to the nouns they modify. Here too, nonce items are treated just like their established counterparts and differently from words in multi-word stretches. Those parallel donor language grammar. And the same is true of all the other diagnostics of French grammatical structure we studied. Loan English words, whether spontaneous nonce forms or long established loanwords, assume the grammatical structure of French. As a matter of fact, our diachronic work shows that they do this right away, but I can talk about that after. So what have we seen so far? Well, we extracted over 20,000 tokens of English origin items from a huge bilingual corpus, and we distinguished them according to purely objective criteria: size, one word versus longer, and one or more measure of frequency, recurrence, and or attestation. This gave us 3 categories of other language material: single nonce words, single established loanwords, and words in longer stretches of the other language. We compared them to each other and to the respective benchmark languages, the donor language and the recipient language. And we found first that single words outweigh multi-word stretches by a factor of 11. And second, words in multi-word stretches are governed by the grammar of the donor language, while single words, which initially looked like 2 categories, right, nonce words and more frequent, all align with the grammar of the recipient. This shows that single other language items tend to be borrowed, even if only for the nonce. They don't have to be, because there's no constraint against switching single words, but they are. What this means is that a study that labels loan items as code switches is basically describing the behavior of borrowings, at least in the French-English case we studied. But the ultimate test of this claim is whether it can be reproduced. So my students and I have been exploring this question by applying the same methodology to more than a dozen language pairs. Here's an example from one of them, Tamil English.
80%, 90% positive. Whereas because you really have to understand, and professors keep setting different papers every year sometimes, okay? Not all the time, but most of the professors, like, they think of original questions and they said it. Whereas India, repeat question, and essay questions, அப்புறம் எப்படி கரெக்ட் பண்றானோ பகவானுக்கு வெளிச்சம். இதை எப்படியா கரெக்ட் பண்ணி 33 வந்துடுறது. You think you are going to get a 90, you land up with 33. You think you're going to get 35, you land up with 75.
Now, because most of these languages are typologically different from English and French, they offer a rich assortment of linguistic diagnostics that can be exploited to assess which grammar is operating on the loan items. We tested all of the ones listed here and more. In doing this, we make explicit use of the comparative approach I've been talking about informally up to now, and that involves comparing the contentious nonce items to a number of benchmarks. These include mixed items whose status is not controversial, like the attested loanwords, which we know are governed by the grammar of the recipient language, and also multi-word switches, which we know abide by the grammar of the donor language, to the extent that these are available, of course. As I noted earlier, if multi-word code switches are sparse in a massive corpus, they may well be altogether absent in smaller corpora. And in some of these language pairs, there may be no independent means of identifying established loanwords either. But it's always possible to confront the loan items against the same speaker's unmixed recipient language, and often her donor language too. And you can see this illustrated right here, just in the red and black sections of the example you heard. I can't stress enough how crucial it is to look at these benchmarks, and especially the speaker's own version of them, as opposed to some standard variety that possibly nobody even speaks. Usually there's a lot of variation hiding in there, and that turns out to be a powerful diagnostic of language membership. So what did these other language pairs teach us? I just want to quickly review some of the results. One of them involves Tunisian Arabic and French mixing in the DP. The definite determiner in Arabic is realized as l in most contexts, but when it precedes a coronal consonant, it assimilates, resulting in gemination of the initial segment. The French definite determiner, only varies according to number and gender of the noun. Now, the bilingual speakers we studied always apply the gemination rule to Arabic nouns in Arabic contexts, as we would have expected, but never to French nouns in unmixed French, also expected. But when they incorporate coronal initial French nouns into Arabic, they treat them exactly like Arabic nouns. They categorically assimilate the definite determiner. Another example comes from Persian and English, languages which conflict in word order, English being SVO, while Persian is largely SOV. As Monzadeh showed, English origin verbs incorporated into Persian are always final, patterning exactly like Persian. These two languages also have conflicting strategies for adjective placement. Persian predicate adjectives precede the linking verb, while attributed adjectives appear postnominally in the ezafe construction, which is similar to the English genitive of phrase. English displays the opposite order, as you can see from the glosses, and as the results confirm. Predicate adjectives follow the linking verb, and attributive adjectives precede the noun. But here again, lone English origin adjectives, both attributive and predicative, always behave identically to their Persian counterparts. And these cases are virtually categorical, 100%. Single donor language items, whether they're established loanwords or nonce words, are simply made to behave like the recipient language. This is remarkable, but it isn't always this way. Consider the case of Tamil and English that you just heard. Tamil is also an SOV language with case marking. English is largely SVO, so there are plenty of conflicts. Of course, this doesn't stop people from copious mixing, as you heard earlier. But other than in the nominative, Tamil nouns are supposed to be case marked, and that's what should happen with English nouns too, and does at least some of the time. Here's an example where you can see the noun car is marked with the Tamil accusative marker A. But there are also plenty of examples like this, where the accusative marker is absent from the noun seal. And in fact, when we do the math for the most populated cases, we see that English origin nouns lack a case marker in quite a substantial number of dative contexts. And in accusative context, actually the vast majority surface bare without the marker. Why should this be? Well, many researchers would say that English nouns like seal, which fail to show the Tamil case marker, are code switches. and therefore they never required a case marker in the first place. But that wouldn't explain why dative is so often marked while accusative so rarely is. How could such a pattern derive from English when English grammar supplies no case marking at all? To support a code switching explanation, you'd have to show that the null mark came from English and not from Tamil. And this is tricky. So how would you do it? By appealing to the benchmarks. Because as it turned out, when we analyzed code mixing in unmixed Tamil, which I think was the first time ever, we learned that case marking is variable. And when we compare the native Tamil nouns with English ones, we find striking similarities. Not only are the overall marking rates parallel, but so is the preference for marking dative over accusative. So this was our first crucial indication that even native language variability is marshaled as part of the integration of borrowed material. And when we do our cross-linguistic validation, we get lots of corroborating evidence, because almost the same situation obtains in Japanese, another SOV language in which case marking is variable. Here too, English nouns incorporated into Japanese are case marked at the same rates and in the same relative proportions as their Japanese counterparts, showing more case marking in subject position than in object position. These patterns couldn't possibly be due to chance, nor could they possibly come from English. And to my mind, this kind of demonstration is the strongest possible proof that loan donor language items are governed by recipient language grammar, even by the recipient language variable grammar, and as we'll see, by the constraints on that grammar. It also highlights the importance of contextualizing, because without an understanding of the functioning of the languages going into the contact, as they're actually used on the ground, we would have missed this key generalization about the behavior of other language items. Now, what if there's no morphology at all? Well, we've studied 3 isolating languages that feature virtually no overt morphology in the NP, Wolof, as spoken in Senegal, and Fongbe, spoken in Benin, mixed with French, as well as Igbo from Nigeria, mixed with English. In these language pairs, conflicts reside in the syntax of nouns and NPs. Here's an example from Eze's mixing data on Igbo English.
This and that just to discourage you. Oh, crash! Conde go man actually in the Moyebi, Linus, Emeka. So, Hashim no good man. The other boy, the mama, Omalam, and all the shots. Really, all the shots. It's a short man, but all the very kind.
This slide shows 4 diagnostics: type of determiner, type of nominal reference, type of marker on nouns with generic reference, and structure of the NP. And for each one, comparison of the unmixed benchmarks identifies a conflict between unmixed Igbo and unmixed English. Once again, the lone English origin nouns in Igbo behave just like the unmixed Igbo nouns and unlike the English nouns in unmixed English. They are most often undetermined. They're much more likely to have generic reference, to favor a null mark, and to display Igbo-specific syntactic structure. And comparison with counterparts in multi-word code switches yields an even more compelling demonstration of the difference between lone donor language items and longer stretches. Words in code switches behave just like those in unmixed English. Because code switches are governed by donor language grammar, while in lone items, only recipient language grammar is operating. Mustafawi's study of Gulf Arabic English bilingual discourse also based on a full range of comparisons, again confirmed that established loanwords pattern with native Arabic words, and loan items once again align with them and differ both from those in benchmark English and code switching to English. Just one last for today, and perhaps the most complex example, comes from Nguyen's study of Vietnamese, French, English trilinguals. She situated both loan English and loan French origin nouns with respect to unmixed Vietnamese, as well as to like items produced in multi-word switches to each of these languages. This table I'm showing you here displays 3 conflicts involving the relative positioning of demonstratives, adjectives, and possessors vis-a-vis the noun. The results reveal that loan nouns incorporated into Vietnamese, whether of English origin or of French origin, show parallel nominal modification patterns to their recipient language counterparts. And at the same time, they differ, often categorically, from nouns in code switches to each of the donor languages. So loan items, whatever their etymology, shed their original grammar to assume the grammar of the recipient language. You can find a lot more detail about all of these examples in my book, which also contains many other demonstrations of similar results based on other diagnostics and other language pairs. But for now, to summarize, I just want to say one major motivation for all this work was to find a way out of the prevailing impasse over how to theorize constraints on the various instantiations of language mixing. We believe that our best chance lies in improving the fit between theory and data. And we went about this by going straight to the source, bilingual speakers themselves in the context of their bilingual speech communities. We recorded about 500 of them in total and systematically analyzed their speech. We found that the bilingual portions of that speech were made up overwhelmingly of loan other language items. And this explains why that's what my talk was about, even though it was advertised as being about code switching. As it turns out, these loan items are not only the most frequent instantiation of language mixing, they're also the locus of the most contentious issue in language mixing research, whether and how to distinguish them from unambiguous multi-word code switching. The facts presented here, which I just want to stress, came from data-driven reports of rates, conditioning, and statistical significance, lead us to conclude, resoundingly so, in the affirmative. Because regardless of how linguists may feel about it, bilingual speakers treat single other language items, again, whether nonce or established, like their recipient language counterparts, while switching multi-word fragments into the grammar of the donor language. Taken together, these facts suggest that any model of language mixing with pretensions to constituting a unified theory of language contact instead is an approximation to a theory of lexical borrowing. The empirical distinction between code switching and borrowing is perhaps the greatest contribution of this work to the field of contact linguistics, because it frees researchers to construct their theories based on the facts, instead of abstracting away from them. That is, based on the material that they claim to be explaining, rather than on data muttered by disparate phenomena that behave in demonstrably different ways. Muito obrigada por ter escutado.
Thank you very much, Shana. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I can't see you though.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just going to read some questions here, and you can answer if, like, as you read it. The first one is by Larissa Curry, and she says, I don't know if she'll mention that, but anyway, I'd like to know what she thinks about UG constraints on the bilingual L2 performance.
Well, that's a good and a big question. You'd have to know, first of all, what UG constraints we're talking about. We would need to find a way to operationalize those constraints, and then we could confront them with performance data and see whether or not they hold.
Okay, and there's another question. She's regarding literature. How do you see the usage of Sainka or Shuna Achebe novels or excerpts from them in ELT, while the authors use Yoruba and English within the novels?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that question?
Yeah, it's about literature. There is two authors, Wale Sainka and Shuna Achebe.
Wale Sainka. Yeah.
And they switch between Yoruba and English, and the person is asking how do you see that? What do you think of that, like in terms of literature, the code switching literature?
Oh, I think it's fine as literature. I think it's a potentially a fine representation of how bilinguals actually use their languages. Whether the code switching is actually faithful to the way the speakers actually do the switching is another question altogether, an interesting question. And it would be very interesting to compare the code switching with actual behavior on the ground. Very frequently we see literary use of code switching which actually doesn't correspond in any way to what we hear, and which often even violates grammaticality constraints in the languages concerned, when in fact speakers themselves almost never violate the grammaticality of the two languages involved.
There is another question, which is, does the level of borrowing, integration, code switches, loan words have to do with the language status of the borrowed language, majority, minority?
No, it does not. We find in all of these different language pairs and in comparing English, French code switching when English is the majority language and when English is the minority language, the same for French, that the same basic constraints hold. So in general, when we're dealing with material that is being borrowed, it is integrated into recipient language structure, and we have not yet found any language in which that does not take place, even though the actual physical appearance of that integration will depend wholly on the grammatical structure of the language it's being integrated into, and even more so, the way the speaker themselves uses that language. So the use of the bilingual may, for example, be totally non-standard in certain areas, and in that instance, we would expect the forms to be integrated into that form. Obviously, the speaker is only going to integrate into the language that they speak. And on the other hand, the code switching is going to adopt the grammar of the lexifier language. And that seems to be completely independent of majority versus minority status of either of the languages involved.
Okay, and there is one more question. Is
Sure.
there any statistic of how many switches in different languages can be used in a sentence or sequence by a multilingual speaker?
Not that I know of. The longer the sentence, the more sites there would be for switches, but we don't just switch anywhere in the sentence. There are felicitous sites for code switching. In my model, those would be equivalent sites, areas where the syntax of the two languages is parallel. So all of this would depend on the length of the sentence and how many legal code switching sites there are in a sentence. And as far as I know, no one has ever yet taken that measure. You'd need a very large corpus to begin with, as I have been saying, since code switches are actually quite rare. But it's an interesting question.
Okay, there is just one more question. What is the unit, how local, to decide what are the recipient donor language? And what is the threshold? What happens in cases where the two languages are fairly balanced?
Could you try that again? I
yeah,
didn't
sure.
catch the question.
So what is the unit, how local, to decide what are the recipient donor language? And what is the threshold? What happens in cases where the two languages are fairly balanced?
I'm not 100% sure I get this, but in general, we would consider an insertion to be something that is surrounded on the left and on the right by another language. So that could happen even when the two languages are completely balanced. You could easily get a segment of the sentence that has that is, for example, in English, that has a French insertion in it. I don't think that there's, you know, we don't set a threshold in advance. It would be determined by the data.
Okay, Shana, I think that there are some more questions in the chat, but you can see that afterwards if you want, okay, and answer there in the chat if you want.
Sure.
It's in there. But I'd like to thank you very much. Marta, do you want to say something?
Alô? Shana, tá me ouvindo?
Oi, Marta.
A pergunta pode ser boba, mas né, é de alguém que não é da área. Quando variedades, chamadas variedades de uma mesma língua, em que elas são bem diferentes, você já enfrentou essa situação de analisar duas, dentro do que a gente chama de uma mesma língua? Você já trabalhou com essa relação das suas ideias?
De uma língua já misturada?
Não, português brasileiro, ou é um continente, né? Nós temos muitas variedades. E algumas, assim, você vai na Baixada Cuiabana, por exemplo, você tem uma variedade com características bem particulares. Você vai para a área rural, você tem algumas outras características, você vai para a área urbana. Quero saber se no seu trabalho você já analisou o que se chamam de variedades dentro de uma mesma língua. Sob a sua perspectiva.
Em geral, eu faria uma distinção entre a variação dentro de uma só língua, que seria uma variação interna, e a alternância entre línguas onde temos mais estruturas realmente distintas. Não sei se percebo bem a pergunta realmente.
Não, percebeu, mas é a ideia de levar umas consequências o que é uma língua. Ainda mais quando você pensa num país tão vasto como o Brasil, que nós temos uma mesma macrocomunidade de fala, nós temos uma mesma macrolíngua. Quando a gente pensa, por exemplo, na relação entre o português brasileiro e o português europeu, né? Embora as pessoas ainda falem, quer dizer, com relação ao português europeu, eu imagino como línguas diferentes, embora isso seja discutível. mas eu não estou nem colocando aí. Estou pensando dentro do Brasil como um todo, em que você vai na Baixada Cuiabana, você vai no sul do país, você vai no norte, ou na área urbana, na área rural. Se poderíamos aplicar alguma a sua análise.
Acho que pode aplicar, mas o que precisamos é muito mais linguistas para estudar muitas mais variedades e ver como funcionam, não é?
Pois é.
Ok. Muito obrigado, Shana. Thank you very much for your participation. And
obrigada, sou eu.
Thanks a lot.
Eu também.
Thank you.
Obrigada
bye.
também por estar aqui participando um pouquinho.
Obrigada.
Dessa iniciativa maravilhosa da Abralin, né? Que foi fantástica.